The first person Logan Pierce dismissed that morning was the only one who saw the building fail before it happened. "You can tell who people think you are by how they ask you to move," Logan Pierce said without slowing his stride, his voice cutting clean across the marble lobby as if it belonged to the building itself, and the man kneeling on the floor, Arthur Bennett, shifted his bucket 2 inches to the right without looking up, the gray water inside barely rippling as a polished shoe stopped just short of it. "Not there?" Logan added, sharper now, glancing down for less than a second. Just enough to register a uniform that wasn't tailored, hands that weren't manicured, and a presence that didn't belong in his version of the frame. "We have investors walking through in 5 minutes. And Arthur nodded once, slow, precise, like he had already measured the timing before Logan spoke, his rag moving in steady lines that didn't leave streaks, didn't double back, didn't waste motion, while behind them the glass doors opened and closed in controlled intervals. Security badges chimed. Heels clicked. Voices lowered automatically when Logan passed because people adjusted around him without being told, because that was how power worked here. Visible, directional, expected, and everything else, everything like Arthur, existed to be moved aside, absorbed, erased. "Facilities should keep you out of sight during peak hours," Logan said, already turning away, already done with the exchange before it had fully happened, and Arthur wrung the cloth once. Exact pressure, no dripping, no hesitation, then placed it back on the marble and continued, his shoulders slightly angled so foot traffic could pass without breaking stride. A small adjustment that no one noticed because it didn't interrupt anything, and that was the point. The lobby lights reflected in the floor in long clean bands, broken only where Arthur hadn't reached yet, and he tracked those gaps the way someone else might track numbers or lines on a chart, quietly closing them, one by one, until the surface held no memory of what had just been there. A spill, a misstep, a moment, and as Logan's reflection moved across the polished stone. Tall, controlled, unquestioned. It never once intersected with Arthur's, not because they weren't in the same space, but because one of them had already learned how to disappear inside it, and when a junior associate rushed past too fast, nearly clipping the bucket, Arthur's hand moved before the impact, steadying it without looking, without breaking rhythm, as if the correction had been calculated long before the mistake occurred. And the associate didn't even realize how close he'd come to stumbling, didn't slow, didn't turn, just kept going toward the elevators where Logan was already being greeted, already being listened to, already shaping the narrative of the day, while behind them, the floor returned to a perfect mirror, and the man who made it that way stood up only when there was nothing left to fix, lifting the bucket with a controlled motion that suggested weight he didn't need to think about, his eyes passing once over the ceiling cameras, over the corners where reflections didn't quite align, then back down again as if confirming something no one had asked him to check, before he moved on without a sound, leaving behind a space that looked like it had never needed him at all. People did not notice patterns until something broke, and nothing in that building was allowed to break, not during a week like this, not with federal contracts on the line and a press release already drafted before the signatures were even dry, and Logan Pierce moved through the upper floors with the same measured certainty he had in the lobby, adjusting details that most people would never see but that he believed defined control. The angle of a chair in a conference room, the placement of a name card, the timing between elevator doors opening and closing, everything calibrated to project precision, while below, Arthur Bennett followed a different map entirely, one that was never printed, never shared, a quiet understanding of how the building actually behaved when no one was watching it, the slight delay in the west hallway badge reader that sometimes required a second tap, the way the air conditioning unit on the 12th floor hummed half a second before cycling on, the reflection on the glass panels that revealed movement before sound reached the corner, and he moved through his tasks with that awareness layered underneath, not interfering, just present, as he replaced a liner in a trash can near the security desk and paused for a fraction longer than necessary, his eyes catching the monitor wall without turning his head, noticing how one of the camera feeds flickered once, barely perceptible, a skipped frame that most people would dismiss as a signal hiccup, but it repeated again exactly 12 seconds later, and again, consistent, predictable, wrong in a way that did not announce itself, and the guard on duty did not react because nothing had happened yet, nothing visible, nothing reportable, just a system that still appeared to be working, and Arthur tied the liner, set it in place, and moved on without a word, carrying that detail with him the same way he carried everything else. Stored, indexed, waiting. While upstairs Logan stood at the head of the conference table, rehearsing the flow of the meeting with his executive team, his voice controlled, deliberate, reminding them of the stakes, reminding them that perception was leverage, that nothing in the next 45 minutes could feel uncertain, because uncertainty was where doubt entered, and doubt was where deals weakened, and as he spoke, an assistant adjusted the blinds by a fraction of an inch to reduce glare on the presentation screen. Another checked the temperature setting to keep the room at exactly 72 degrees, and every element aligned with the image Logan intended to project. A system under command, a narrative without friction, while on the service corridor 1 floor below, Arthur stopped at a junction where 2 hallways met, listening not to voices but to timing, to the rhythm of footsteps above, to the faint delay between movement and echo, confirming distances without looking, and when he resumed walking, it was with a slight change in pace, subtle enough that no one would register it as urgency, but deliberate enough that he reached the next stairwell 3 seconds earlier than he would have otherwise, as if he were already adjusting for something that had not yet been acknowledged. And when a young employee passed him carrying a stack of folders too high to see over, Arthur shifted his path by half a step, creating space before the near collision could happen. The folders remaining steady. The employee continuing without realizing how close the moment had come to tipping, and Arthur did not look back, did not check, because the outcome had already been accounted for, just like the flicker in the camera feed, just like the small inconsistencies that did not belong in a place that depended on perfection. And as he reached the landing, he glanced once toward the ceiling where another camera sat fixed in its housing, its indicator light steady, its lens angled exactly where it should be, and still, something about its timing did not match the rest of the building, a gap so small it could hide in plain sight, unless someone knew to look for it, unless someone had spent enough time in systems that failed quietly before they failed completely, and Arthur adjusted his grip on the handle of his cart. Not tightening, not hesitating, just preparing in a way that did not require acknowledgment, because whatever was coming had not announced itself yet, but it was already on its way. By the time the first black SUV rolled up to the curb, the building had already shifted into performance mode, glass doors opening in perfect intervals, security scanning badges without delay. Every movement aligned to the schedule Logan Pierce had approved down to the minute, and inside the main conference floor the air held a quiet pressure, the kind that came from people who understood that a single misstep could echo far beyond the room, while Logan stood near the head of the table. Reviewing the final briefing, his voice low but firm as he reminded his team that timing was leverage and that nothing about today could feel improvised, because improvised meant uncontrolled and uncontrolled meant risk, and risk was something he did not allow into spaces he managed. While 2 floors below, Arthur Bennett guided his cart into a service alcove and paused again, not because his route required it but because the pattern did, because the flicker he had seen earlier had not resolved. It had stabilized, repeating at exact intervals that now shortened by a fraction of a second, a change so small it would disappear inside normal variance unless someone was measuring it against memory, and Arthur reached up, not to touch the camera but to align his view with its angle, watching the reflection in a stainless steel panel across the hall, counting silently 1, 2, 3 until the frame skipped again, confirming what the system itself did not report, that something upstream was misaligned, not broken, not yet, but drifting in a way that would compound under load, and today the building was about to be under more load than usual. More access points, more overrides, more simultaneous demands than the system had processed in weeks, and as he lowered his hand, the elevator at the end of the corridor chimed and opened, releasing 2 security personnel who moved with purpose toward the main floor. Their conversation clipped, controlled, mentioning a last-minute adjustment to access privileges for a visiting official, a temporary expansion of clearance zones that would allow movement across sections normally restricted, and Arthur did not turn toward them, did not acknowledge the information, but it settled into place alongside everything else. The timing, the flicker, the upcoming increase in system demand, pieces that did not yet form a problem but were no longer independent, and upstairs the conference doors opened as the first group of guests entered, measured handshakes, brief smiles, eyes scanning the room in the same way Logan had, assessing not just the presentation but the control behind it, and Logan stepped forward to greet them, posture exact, voice steady, setting the tone before anyone else could, while screens along the wall displayed live feeds from across the building, each camera showing calm, order, continuity, a system functioning as intended, and for a moment everything held, every element aligned with the narrative being presented, until on one of the smaller monitors, barely noticeable at the edge of the display, a frame hesitated, just long enough to be out of rhythm with the others, and then corrected itself, smooth again, seamless to anyone not watching for it, and no one in the room reacted because there was nothing to react to, Nothing that had crossed the threshold from anomaly to incident, nothing that required attention, and yet on the service level Arthur was already moving again. His pace unchanged but his route adjusted, taking a stairwell instead of the elevator, shaving seconds in a way that would not be visible to anyone tracking his schedule, because he was not tracking time the way they were, not in minutes and meetings, but in sequences, in cause and effect, in the space between what a system shows and what it actually does. And as he reached the next landing he paused only long enough to listen, not for alarms but for absence, for the lack of expected signals, the subtle gaps that appear just before something surfaces, and when he resumed, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who did not need confirmation to act, because whatever was about to happen had already begun, even if no one with authority had recognized it yet. The first sign that something had shifted did not come as an alarm but as a pause, a half-second hesitation in a system that had been designed to eliminate hesitation entirely, and inside the conference room Logan Pierce continued speaking without interruption, outlining projections, timelines, control points, his voice steady as the wall displays behind him cycled through live feeds of the building, each camera presenting order, continuity, compliance, until one of the guests, a senior official whose attention had been divided between the presentation and the room itself, glanced briefly toward the screen and narrowed his focus, not reacting outwardly, not yet, just noticing that one feed did not align with the others, that a hallway camera showed a clean, empty corridor at the same moment another angle suggested movement should have been there. A discrepancy so small it could be dismissed, but it lingered, and downstairs Arthur Bennett reached the security access panel near the secondary stairwell, setting his cart aside with controlled placement so it would not drift or obstruct. And he did not rush, because rushing created noise, and noise drew attention, and attention at the wrong moment would slow everything. So instead he moved with the same measured precision he had used on the marble floor, removing the panel with a sequence that suggested familiarity without force, exposing a set of cables and a diagnostic port that most employees would not recognize, and he did not plug anything in, did not override the system, he simply observed, listening to the subtle variations in the electrical hum, watching the indicator lights cycle, mapping their rhythm against the pattern he had already memorized, confirming that the delay was not random, not external interference, but a synchronization drift between internal nodes, the kind that allowed data to appear complete while it was already misaligned. And above him the building continued its performance, Logan, guiding the conversation toward the moment of agreement, emphasizing reliability, security, control, each word supported by the very system that was beginning to slip beneath the surface. And when one of his team members requested a live demonstration of the security tracking interface, Logan nodded without hesitation, confident, because confidence was part of the contract he was offering, and the screen shifted to a real-time layout of the building, showing movement paths, access logs, location markers updating in smooth intervals, everything appearing exactly as it should. While in the stairwell Arthur closed the panel and picked up his cart again, already adjusting his route, because the demonstration upstairs would increase system load in a way that accelerated the drift, compressing the margin between unnoticed and visible, and as he moved he passed a wall-mounted display that mirrored a simplified version of the tracking system, and for a fraction of a second one of the markers blinked out of sequence, disappearing and reappearing just slightly off its expected path, enough to register if someone was looking for it, and Arthur was, and he slowed by less than a step, recalculating, not questioning whether there was a problem but determining where it would surface first, because systems did not fail everywhere at once. They failed where the pressure was highest, where assumptions replaced verification, and at that exact moment, in the conference room above, the demonstration cursor paused over a highlighted identifier, a visiting guest whose access had just been elevated minutes earlier, and when the operator attempted to confirm the location, the system responded, but not immediately, a delay so brief it could be mistaken for network latency, except it did not match the behavior Logan had promised. And in that space between expectation and response, something changed in the room, not panic, not yet, but a shift in attention, a subtle recalibration as people who understood systems began to watch more closely. While Arthur continued toward the main floor, his pace still controlled, his expression unchanged, because for him the moment had already passed the point of recognition and moved into response, and the only question left was how quickly the rest of the building would realize what he already knew. The delay did not repeat the same way twice after that, and that was what made it visible not to everyone, but to the few who knew that a stable error could hide longer than an unstable one. And inside the conference room the operator attempted to refresh the tracking interface again, this time more deliberately, as if intention could correct timing, and for a brief moment the system responded faster, almost overcompensating, placing markers exactly where they should be, restoring the illusion of control, and Logan Pierce continued speaking through it, adjusting his tone just slightly, reinforcing confidence, because he understood that perception could absorb small inconsistencies if it remained uninterrupted. And across the table the visiting official leaned back a fraction, watching not just the screen but the people responding to it, measuring their reactions instead of their words, while on the main floor Arthur Bennett stepped out of the stairwell and into the open corridor that led toward the conference level, his cart rolling beside him with a steady rhythm that did not echo, did not draw attention, and he glanced once toward a wall display showing the same simplified tracking feed. And this time the discrepancy was no longer a flicker but a drift, a marker moving along a path that did not correspond to the physical layout, cutting across a section that had no connecting hallway, a path that only existed inside the system, not in the building itself, and Arthur adjusted his direction immediately, leaving the corridor and taking a narrower service passage that ran parallel to the main route, shortening distance without increasing visibility, because speed was not about moving faster, it was about removing everything unnecessary. And upstairs the operator spoke quietly, confirming that one of the guest identifiers was not resolving correctly, that the system showed movement but could not reconcile it with access logs, a mismatch that did not trigger an alert because each individual component still appeared valid, and Logan's jaw tightened for the first time, not enough for most people to see, but enough to shift the cadence of his next sentence, because this was no longer a presentation detail, this was a gap between what he had promised and what the system could demonstrate, and he moved closer to the screen, not to take control but to reduce the distance between himself and the problem, as if proximity could contain it, while the room grew quieter in a way that did not signal panic but focus, attention narrowing, conversation stopping mid-thought. And at that same moment Arthur reached a locked service door and did not hesitate, using a badge that granted limited access, waiting the exact half-second needed for the reader to process, then opening it before the system could request a second authentication, a timing that relied on understanding the delay he had already mapped. And on the other side the corridor opened into a section directly beneath the conference floor, where sound traveled differently, where footsteps above translated into faint vibrations through the structure, and he paused just long enough to align those signals with the movement he had seen on the display, confirming direction without needing confirmation from the system itself, because the system was no longer reliable in isolation. And back in the conference room the operator finally said it out loud, not loudly but clearly enough that everyone heard it, that one of the guests could not be located within the current tracking parameters, not missing in a way that triggered emergency, but absent in a way that should not be possible under the conditions Logan had guaranteed. And for the first time no one looked at Logan for reassurance, they looked at the screen, and in that shift the control he had built began to separate from him, while below, Arthur was already moving toward where the system said no one was, because that was exactly where the truth would be. Arthur Bennett did not look at the wall displays anymore because they had already told him everything they could, and what remained was not on the screen but in the structure itself, in the timing of doors, in the way sound carried through the floor, in the slight misalignment between where people were supposed to be and where their presence actually registered. And as he moved through the lower corridor beneath the conference level, he adjusted his pace again, not faster, just more exact, removing the last margin of error from each step, because now the system was no longer drifting quietly, it was being asked to prove something it could not sustain, and that pressure was exposing the gap, and above him the room had shifted fully into observation, no one speaking unless necessary, the operator tracing the path of the missing identifier again and again as if repetition could stabilize it, while Logan Pierce stood still for a fraction longer than he intended before stepping forward, his voice returning with controlled calm, explaining that temporary inconsistencies could occur during dynamic access updates, framing the situation as expected behavior under expanded clearance conditions. But even as he spoke he knew the explanation was thinner than the confidence he had built, because the system was no longer aligning with his words in real time. And across the table the senior official did not interrupt, did not challenge, just watched, allowing the silence between updates to grow, while below Arthur reached a junction where 3 service routes intersected, and he stopped, not to decide but to confirm, closing his eyes for a brief second as if removing sight would sharpen everything else, counting the interval between footsteps above, mapping their direction against the last known drift on the display, and when he opened his eyes he turned left without hesitation, taking the narrowest corridor, the one that maintenance used only when necessary, because it cut directly beneath a section of the conference floor that had no public access. And as he moved the ambient noise shifted, quieter, more contained, each sound more defined, and he slowed by a fraction, listening for the absence again, for the missing pattern that should have been there, and then he heard it, not a voice, not movement, but the lack of expected motion where the system claimed someone was passing through, a gap between what should exist and what did, and he stepped to a secondary access door, one that required a manual override from inside the service side, and instead of forcing it he reached to the frame, pressing at a specific point where the latch responded to pressure rather than code. A design choice meant for emergencies but forgotten in routine, and the door opened without sound, revealing a short corridor that connected to a restricted section of the main floor, and as he stepped through, the difference was immediate, not visible at first glance but present in the timing, in the way the air felt still, in the absence of foot traffic where there should have been controlled movement, and ahead, at the far end, a figure stood near a closed door, not moving, not signaling, simply waiting in a space where the system had failed to place him correctly, and Arthur did not call out, did not announce himself. He just walked forward at a steady pace, closing the distance with the same precision he had used from the beginning, because this was no longer about finding what was missing, it was about confirming what the system could not hold together. And upstairs, at the exact moment Arthur reached that corridor, the tracking display updated again, and this time the marker snapped into a new position that contradicted every previous path, and the room understood, without anyone saying it, that control had already shifted to something outside the system Logan had promised. The distance between Arthur Bennett and the waiting figure closed without urgency, measured in steady steps that did not echo, did not announce, because nothing about this moment required speed anymore, only accuracy, and as he approached he could see that the man standing near the door was not lost in the way the system suggested but paused, checking his surroundings with the kind of awareness that came from experience, not confusion, and when their eyes met there was no startle, no visible reaction, just a brief recalibration as the man took in the uniform, the cart, the posture, and then looked past it, as if recognizing something that did not match the role, and Arthur stopped at a distance that respected space without yielding control, his voice low, even, "This corridor does not connect where your access says it does." And the man glanced once at the closed door behind him, then back, processing the statement not as a warning but as information. "The system shows I am clear to proceed," he replied, calm, but with a question beneath it, and Arthur nodded once. "The system is out of sync by less than a second, but enough to misplace you." And for a moment neither of them moved, because what mattered was not the explanation but the next decision, and Arthur shifted his weight slightly, turning just enough to indicate an alternate path. "There is a direct route that will align with your clearance," he said, not instructing, not insisting, just presenting a correction. And the man studied him for a fraction longer, then stepped forward, accepting the adjustment without asking for credentials, because some forms of authority did not need to be displayed, they were recognized in how information was delivered, and as they moved together down the corridor, Arthur adjusted his pace to match, guiding without leading, ensuring that each turn corresponded to a path that actually existed rather than one projected by the system, and above them the conference room had shifted again, the operator now silent, hands resting on the console as the display continued to update in ways that no longer formed a coherent pattern. Markers appearing and correcting, paths overlapping, the visual representation of a system attempting to reconcile inputs it could not fully align, and Logan Pierce stood at the edge of that display, no longer speaking, because any statement he made would now be measured against something visibly unstable, and across the table the senior official leaned forward slightly, his attention no longer divided, his focus fixed not on the data itself but on how Logan responded to its failure, while on the restricted corridor Arthur and the man reached a junction that opened into a monitored section of the main floor, and as they stepped through, a security officer at the far end turned, ready to question the unexpected approach, but paused mid-step as his gaze settled on the visitor, recognition immediate, posture shifting from intercept to acknowledgment, and then his eyes moved to Arthur, taking in the uniform again, the cart, the position, and hesitating, because the two did not align in any expected hierarchy, and in that hesitation the structure of assumption revealed itself. Who was supposed to guide and who was supposed to follow, who was visible and who was not, and the man Arthur had guided spoke before the question could form, his voice carrying just enough authority to settle the moment. "He corrected your system before it corrected itself." And the officer straightened slightly, processing the statement, his attention now fully on Arthur in a way it had not been before, while upstairs the door to the conference room opened, not abruptly but with intention, and a member of the security team stepped inside, approaching Logan with a quiet urgency that did not need volume to be understood, And in that space between words, between explanation and realization, the control Logan had built shifted again. Not taken, not forced, but redefined by the presence of something he had not accounted for. Something that had already acted while his system was still deciding what was true. The conference room did not erupt, it compressed, voices lowering instead of rising, attention narrowing to the space between Logan Pierce and the security officer who had stepped beside him, and whatever was said between them was brief, measured, and enough to change the temperature of the room, because Logan did not respond immediately. He listened, and that alone was new, while across the table the senior official remained still. His gaze steady, not demanding explanation, allowing the moment to define itself, and on the display the tracking interface continued to update, but now it no longer commanded belief, it existed as a reference that required interpretation, and Logan turned slightly toward the screen, then back to the room, recalculating not the system but his position within it, because control had shifted from certainty to response, and every second he spent aligning himself would be visible, while on the main floor Arthur Bennett stood just outside the conference entrance, his cart positioned to the side where it did not obstruct movement, his presence aligned with the wall as if he had always been part of the background, and the man he had guided spoke quietly with a member of the security team, confirming his identity without raising his voice, without drawing attention, and when the door opened again, the subtle hierarchy in the room adjusted, not announced but felt as the same man stepped inside with the security officer, leaving Arthur in the threshold between spaces, neither inside nor fully outside, and for a moment no one in the room looked at him, because the focus had not yet shifted that far, and then the senior official spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity that redirected every eye, asking a single question about how the discrepancy had been resolved, not in terms of system correction but in terms of actual movement through the building, and the answer did not come from Logan, it came from the man who had just entered. He identified the gap before your system could, and the room followed the direction of that statement, attention moving toward the doorway where Arthur stood, and for the first time he was not invisible, not because he had changed, but because the context had, and Logan's gaze reached him a fraction of a second later than everyone else's, recognition not immediate but assembling, connecting the figure in the lobby, the uniform, the presence he had dismissed, with the outcome now standing in front of him, and he took a step toward the doorway, not aggressive, not uncertain, but controlled in a way that attempted to reclaim alignment. "You work in facilities," he said, the statement more than a question, as if placing Arthur back into a category would restore order, and Arthur met his gaze without tension, without challenge, just steady. "Yes," he said, the word carrying no defense, no explanation, and Logan held that for a moment, searching for a frame that would reassert structure. But the room had already moved past that need, because what mattered was not where Arthur belonged in the hierarchy, but what he had done outside of it, and the senior official leaned forward slightly, studying Arthur with a different kind of attention, one that measured not appearance but consistency, the way he stood, the way he spoke, the absence of excess in either, and he asked a question that did not fit the room's earlier script. "How did you see it before the system did?" And Arthur did not look at the screen, did not reference data, he answered in the same even tone he had used from the beginning. Timing did not match movement, and the simplicity of it settled into the space more heavily than any technical explanation could have, because it pointed to something the system had missed, and something Logan had not accounted for, and in that moment the authority in the room no longer aligned with position or title, it aligned with accuracy, and Logan felt that shift not as a loss announced, but as a gap he could not close with words alone. For a moment nothing moved except the quiet recalibration of attention, the kind that does not announce itself but changes everything it touches, and Logan Pierce stood in that space with the weight of expectation still on him, but no longer anchored to him, because the room had already shifted toward the man by the door, and the senior official did not look away as he spoke again, not pressing, not praising, just extending the same line of inquiry. "And you corrected it without access." And Arthur Bennett gave a small nod, not as confirmation of skill but of sequence. "Access was not the issue," he said, his voice steady, unforced. "Alignment was." And the words settled with a precision that matched the way he had moved through the building. No excess, no attempt to impress, just accurate. And across the table a few members of Logan's team exchanged brief glances, not in confusion but in recognition that the explanation made sense in a way their own system had not accounted for. And Logan felt that recognition ripple outward, not directed at him but around him, and he adjusted his posture slightly, not defensive but measured, as if recalibrating his presence to fit a new frame. "We will review the synchronization protocols," he said, returning to the language of control of process, but the statement did not carry the same weight it had earlier, because it responded to something that had already been resolved without him, and the senior official leaned back again, considering, then gave a small nod that did not signal approval so much as acknowledgment, and the conversation moved forward, but not in the direction Logan had planned now. Shaped by what had just occurred rather than what had been presented. And as attention shifted away from the doorway, Arthur did not step further into the room, did not wait for recognition to expand. He simply turned, the motion quiet, deliberate, and moved back into the corridor. His cart still where he had left it, handle aligned, wheels still, as if it had been waiting for him to return to it, and he took hold of it with the same controlled grip, not tightening, not hesitating, and began to move away, the sound of the wheels soft against the floor, blending back into the rhythm of the building, and behind him the door closed again, the voices inside resuming in a different cadence, one that no longer revolved around a single center, and Logan remained where he was for a fraction longer than necessary before returning to the table. His role intact but altered. His authority no longer assumed but observed, and in the hallway Arthur passed a wall display that now showed corrected paths, markers aligned, the system appearing whole again, as if it had never drifted, and he did not stop to look at it, because the correction was not the point. The timing had already revealed what mattered, and as he reached the stairwell he paused briefly, not to listen this time, but to confirm stillness, the absence of misalignment, and then continued down, back toward the lower floors where the noise of significance did not reach, where work existed without audience. And when he returned to the marble lobby, the surface was already marked again by new footsteps, faint traces of movement that would need to be cleared, and he set the bucket down, wrung the cloth once, exact pressure, and began again, the same steady lines, the same quiet precision, no different from before, except that somewhere above the understanding of what he was had shifted, even if the work itself had not.